Everybody to another week, another Monday afternoon. Let's see. Okay, it's recording now. All right. So what we're going to be doing today, as far as the slides are concerned, we're going to be introducing database analysis. So what we're going to help understand is the methods that we might use to analyze a system, to be able to understand how it works for how we might create a database for it or modify an existing database. But a lot of the tools will be primarily related to creating a database system for one that doesn't, where the database system doesn't currently exist. Maybe a system already is in place. It could be using some other type of technology, spreadsheets or something else. But this is going to be for how to analyze such a system to be able to help us not just try to just go out there and start creating tables or creating columns, but actually have a plan in place for how we're going to go about developing the system later. Okay, but first let me share something else. So I posted the first group project assignment to the Microsoft Teams. I specifically went through and selected all of your team leaders to receive this assignment. So not everyone got this assignment. So if you are not the team leader, you did not get this assignment assigned to you. Only the 22 group leaders that I have recorded as group leaders received this assignment. So it is up to them to share this file with you, to share the information of this with you. Okay, but I did want to go over it because I knew there would probably be some questions, and I want to make sure that everyone understands what the expectations are. So you have just over 4 weeks actually here to complete this. Actually, it looks like, what was that, 5 weeks actually. Okay, so you got a long time. All right, but it's going to go by fast, so start early rather than late. Okay, so make sure you start earlier rather than late. Okay. Now, this will be 40%. I made it out of 40 points to make it easy for everybody. This will be 40% of your final project grade. Now, each of you will have your own project grade, but then I will also base, each of you may have an individual grade based on your participation in the project. Okay. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to create a third normal form database out of, basically you don't have anything yet, all right? So you're going to go through the process of analyzing a system, whatever it is that you guys chose or were approved for your a system. You will need to have at least 30 columns, at least 30 data items to start with, okay? So what you will do is then you will take those through the normalization process. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. You'll want to bring the data that you collect, example data, into a single table, all right? One table. Then you'll follow the normalization process, which we will describe in 2 weeks. When we're in class in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the normalization process. And then from the normalized database, you will create an entity relationship diagram. That'll be the next set of slides after the one that we're going to do today. I looked through what we need to do for today and the next set, the entity relationship slide set, and it looks to me like we'll actually probably be able to get to that tomorrow. We'll probably be able to get to that this week, but we'll see. Yeah, we'll see how today goes. All right, so you'll have to create the tables, put the data into these tables using queries from what's called the unnormalized form. We'll talk about that when we talk about normalization. Okay, so these are the 4 things that you'll need to send to me, that you'll need to send through that Microsoft Teams assignment. A list of the data items being maintained, and a set of data in a grid or a spreadsheet. An ER diagram, SQL queries for both creating the tables and inserting data from the unnormalized form into the third normal form tables. And then a view to recreate the original data set. We'll talk about this one. Actually, you probably should be able to know already, but I'll mention it more as we get closer. All right. So item 1, so the unnormalized set, you could submit it as a spreadsheet, as a grid. Yeah, so you could send it as an Excel spreadsheet, as I guess a link to a Google Sheet, to a shared Google Sheet would be an option as well. Item 2 should be a diagram, either drawn. Ideally, you'll use a tool like an online drawing tool to be able to do this. There's a number of those freely available. And then 3 and 4 should be a bunch of SQL queries. So you could send those as a text document or anything like that. Okay, you could also just write up a report, and it probably would be best to do that because at the end of the semester you will give a final report. So basically what you could do is you could write up a big report in Word or PDF, or Word, or convert it to PDF if you did it from like a Google document, and save it as a PDF. And then whenever the feedback comes from our customer, then you can just edit the existing Microsoft Word document or Google Doc document and basically take that and make that your final report. Okay, so, but any of these are possible. So, all right. So we'll talk through some of the details of all this, of what all this means in future weeks, but I wanted to at least give you a heads up that this had been assigned, and that I would very much encourage you to get looking at this sooner rather than later. Okay, all right, let's see. So now let's talk about database analysis. All right. So we're going to talk about fact-finding techniques today, types of facts that you might collect, and the ways that we can, some of the different fact-finding techniques, some of the pros and the cons, the advantages and disadvantages of each type of technique. What else? We'll look at an example as well. Okay. So the main reason for why we go through all this at the very beginning, these fact-finding techniques, and get through some of these things towards the beginning, is because we may have an idea of what we want to create. We might want to create the next student records like OBS. We might want to create an email system like a Gmail, or Microsoft Outlook uses like with an email server like that. So we might want to think through that. So we want to create that. But if we just sit down and start saying, oh, it needs this, and we start coding stuff and trying to make it happen, if we don't make a plan for how to do this, then it could cause a lot of problems, right? We can end up with a lot of delays later on when we encounter issues that we didn't know about. What's really, what can be a real big problem to a system, to the development of a system, is what's called requirements creep. And what requirements creep is if you do not have an established set of requirements at the beginning of the development of something, then what can happen is your customer, your user, may come in after you've already started developing and say, oh, you know, we didn't say this at the beginning, but we forgot to tell you we need this, whatever it is. It can be some additional requirement that they had not discussed with you before. And if your system is not set up to handle those situations, like good development processes will say, no, you can't add requirements later on. We can do this as part of the next iteration. We could do this as part of the next build we do later. We can add that to the requirements later, But we're not going to do that now because it was not done it was not established at the very beginning. Okay, so that could be one way to handle it. But some of the systems I've worked on, the way that it's been handled is, oh, the customer said this, the customer wants this, the customer gets what they want. And so what would happen is we would be working and developing and we would get this new requirement. And now suddenly it would set us back. Sometimes a long time. Sometimes it'd be an easy requirement to add, but oftentimes it would be something that would set us back and it would delay our release. And so I have to be very careful about not allowing requirements creep to sneak in. But if we go through a formalized process at the beginning to say, this is how we're going to collect facts about the system. We want to understand and analyze the system first. We want to understand what we're getting into first. Then, once that is understood, then we can start the development process. Okay? All right. So, fact-finding techniques are actually used throughout the application lifecycle because this is something else, is our systems can evolve over time. We talked about last week, we looked at some of the mission statements, for example, for different systems like Google and Amazon and stuff like that. And what I did was, after the class, I went back and I looked at what was Amazon's mission statement when they started. What was it? I think I looked at 20 years ago. I think I said, what was Amazon's mission statement in 2001 or 2000, something like that. And it was actually quite a bit different from what it is today. Mostly the same. I don't remember exactly what it was right now, and I don't have it up. But I do remember that it has evolved a little bit. Their mission statement has evolved a little bit, which means also that their systems have evolved over that time as well. Right? And so we do need to not just say, oh, we analyze the system as it existed on, what's today, March 29th, 2021. Therefore, that's how it exists. That's how it's always going to exist. That would be very unwise for us to assume that because something exists as it does today, therefore that's how it's going to exist for all time. So as we go into later maintenance mode and evolution mode, making sure that as the needs of our customer evolve, that we also continue to understand and analyze their requirements and their needs. Okay. One definite benefit is that as developers, we'll be able to learn about some of the terminology and the concerns and problems and requirements, and especially the priorities of our customer and the users of whatever system we're developing for them. Sometimes terminology is a big key thing because they may use words in a certain way. So for example, even here in this class, I've talked about how some of the terms that we use with record and row are the same thing, that column and attribute are the same thing, file and table are the same thing. We've we've talked about how those things mean the same thing, right? And different customers might use similar terminology to mean different things, or they might use two different words to mean the same thing. And we get to kind of learn what the terminology is for some of the things that they're using and what their purpose is. Okay. That can be really helpful for us to be able to understand the language of our customer. I'm sure as many of you have learned through learning English as a second language, and I have tried to as learning Turkish as a second language, that learning the terminology, learning the phrases that exist can be very important, right? Just kind of as a funny example, kind of a humorous example, right? When I was first learning Turkish, I went to go get a cake for. I had a friend at the office that I had. We lived in Ankara at the time, and it was his birthday. And I said, I'm gonna go get a cake for his birthday from the bakery, from the pastane. And I walked in and I looked at the cakes and I saw one that I liked, so I pointed at it and I said, "This one, yeah, şunu istiyorum." And he started to pull it out and he said, "Kestane." And I said, "I don't know what that word means. I don't know what kestane is." So I thought, okay, what do I know? What do I know from Turkey? Okay, kes, I know kes, okay, cut, and I know tane. That means like that's the word they use when they say like I want so many of those. Like I want some of those. Oh, he wants me. He's wondering if I want him to cut it into pieces. And so I said no. And he put the cake back. And I said that's weird. I want that cake. So then I said, okay, let me try again. So I pointed at the cake again. He said, Kestane var, tamam mı? And I said, no, I don't want it cut to pieces. I said to myself, I don't want it cut to pieces. I said, no. And he put it back. And I said, something's wrong. Something's wrong. And I'm thinking it's probably with me, probably with the guy who doesn't know the language, right? Doesn't know the terminology very well. There's some word here that I don't know. So I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. So I pointed at the cake. I said, I want this. He said, Kestane. And I said, yes. Okay, yeah, Kestane's great. Just package the cake. All right. And he goes and he boxes the cake. And I take out my Sözlük, my on my phone, I have a dictionary. And I open it up and I look up Kestane, chestnut. Oh, now I get it. Ah. Okay. There's nuts in the cake. I get it. Okay. So from that point on, I have never forgotten the word kestane since then. I absolutely know what kestane is now. So that's a little bit of a humorous example, but here I was, someone who did not know a certain term. And it really caused a lot of difficulty about what I was trying to get done, didn't it? And so for us as developers of systems, for us to learn the terminology of our customers is very helpful. Okay. I have some other from the tech world. I have other examples if anybody ever wants to hear some of those as well. But anyway, that's just something important for us to be able to know. All right. So we will talk through some of the examples of documentation that we might, some of the documentation we'll produce, but examples of data that we'll be getting. Now, this is not data that will go into our tables necessarily. Some of it's not. Like database planning, we want to know what is the purpose, aims and objectives. What are the purposes of the database project? All right. During the system definition, we're going to describe some major user views. How do our users plan to use them? A big part of where we're going to go with this is going to go into the requirements collection and analysis. This is going to, if done well, this is something that takes a lot longer than we think that it should. Okay, we think that requirements should be easy. We think that it should just be the customer telling us what to make, right? So like even we think that it's like, oh, it's like an assignment. When a professor gives us an assignment, they just give us all the questions. We just have to go answer them. Or they give us what code we should, what our method should do. We just have to go and write the method, right? But it's oftentimes much deeper than that. We need to understand what the requirements for the system are if we're going to be able to have a good foundation for designing our database and our application. Okay. Database design, we'll talk about that. That's what this course is mostly about. So we'll talk about that when we talk about the conceptual, logical, and physical design. The application design, again, that's part of database, because if we're going to access the database, then we need to know how we plan on our users interacting with it. DBMS selection could be a very fast experience because it could be already selected for us. But we do want to have an evaluation of what each DBMS can do. All right. Prototyping, we may need to create a prototype of the system that the users can interact with. They would give us their feedback, and it may modify some of their suggestions. So sometimes where this comes in is we have a certain understanding of what they expected from us, and they have the users and the customers have different understanding, and we need to get on the same page. We implement, we may end up doing a data conversion from another format of the current data. Testing and requirements. Testing and requirements are probably the two parts of system development that we as developers think should be really fast and should not take long, and we do not understand the importance of them. Okay. Testing is probably one of the most important phases if done well. We've talked before, I've mentioned briefly before about how testing, oftentimes part of the problem is that we think as developers, a lot of times we think that testing is what is done to prove that the system works. And we oftentimes think of failed tests as a problem. So we think, I want to pass all the tests, and when I pass all the tests, I've proved that the system works. What usually that results in from a developer's perspective is we end up not testing enough. Because what we do is we throw a few test cases at some code, they all pass, and we say, done. I tested, they all passed, therefore my system works. And I've proven it through test cases. All right. Both of those are the exact opposite way that testing should be looked at. Testing can be used to find problems that exist. It cannot be used to prove that a system works perfectly. So therefore, if testing is done well, it's done thoroughly, and a failed test by a developer or by a quality assurance person is actually a good thing, because it has exposed some flaw in the system that can then be fixed. The big problem, what we don't want to have happen, is we don't want a flaw that we should have tested for and didn't. We don't want a flaw like that getting out to our users and them finding it. That's a big problem. Okay. Anyway, so requirements and testing, we should spend more time on them, but we generally don't want to, and we don't like to, mostly because as developers, we think, not even design, we think really this right here. We think implementation, that's what our job is. And so that's what we try to spend the most time doing. And we think that's what we, so prototyping and implementation, writing code, right? We're like, writing code, that's what we're supposed to do. But if we're doing things well and we want to have a good working system, requirements, design, testing should all be given more focus and more priority. And then finally, operational maintenance. After a system is released and put out there, then we can start maintaining it to check for performance. If the users find that they want some different things, I'm sure you've noticed that your smartphone, your computers get updates quite frequently, and major updates result in a very different user experience than you had before. A lot of that is because they're constantly changing what their requirements are, these companies. All right. All right, so some examples here. All right. Now, normally, now we'll look at these one by one, all these different fact-finding techniques. We'll look at them one by one, but a good database, well, any system, but a good system development process will look at multiple types of, will utilize multiple fact-finding techniques to be able to get a nice round, a nice full robust picture of what the system should look like. Okay, and we'll talk about some of these in detail. We'll talk about these 5 specifically in detail to where we can understand what each is good for and what each may be lacking in, why there might be some problems. Okay, so first, examining documentation. So a system will probably have certain types of documentation, user guides, stuff like that, to help users know how to use the system and things like that. By us examining the documentation that exists for the customer we're working for, we can gain some insight. We can find out, well, how did the need for a database arise? How did they come to, like, what was it about the existing system that was lacking? See, that's the thing, is a lot of times when we are tasked with bringing some new technology, some new implementation of the system in these situations, it's because the existing system was not good enough. There was something about it that needed to change. Right? We want to understand the current system. Now, sometimes it's so that we can basically reproduce the exact system as it existed. Right? I'll give you an example from my own experience. So one system that I worked on they had an Oracle database backend, and for the front end, for the user experience, for the user interface, they used a tool called Oracle Forms and Reports. Now, Oracle Forms and Reports, put out by Oracle, you can imagine works really, really well with Oracle databases. It was amazing. It was really fun to work on that system. Well, the customer decided that they didn't want to pay for the license to use Oracle Forms and Reports anymore in their system. They're perfectly within their rights to do that, and that's okay. But what that meant was that we needed to come up with some other solution for them, right? So we needed to create a user interface that could also, they were still going to use an Oracle database on the back end, but we needed a new user interface. We found out that the old system had been written in a language called Power Builder. So what we did was we said, let's go find the old system in Power Builder and update it to match the current system in Oracle Forms and Reports. We found out pretty quickly that wasn't going to work, but mostly because the old Power Builder system had not been updated in about like 15, 20 years, some crazy amount of time. Well, what happened was as we started taking the Power Builder windows and changing things like updating them with the newer code, we kind of prototyped it and we gave it to the customer representative to test it, and they came back with saying, no, this is all wrong, this is all wrong. And it turned out that what it was what they were upset about was that the colors were wrong. The colors of the windows were not the same. We had used the old color scheme of the Power Builder system, which was like really bright colors like teal and pink and stuff like that. And the newer Oracle Forms and Reports system had used a nice gray based color scheme and much more subdued. And the customer wanted, basically what they wanted was for their users to not even know that the system had changed. They wanted the windows to look exactly the same as the Oracle Forms and Reports version. So what that meant was I needed to go, I spent more time than I can remember going into the Oracle Forms screens and actually figuring out what exact color, like, down to like the RGB numbers, right? What those colors were so that I could make the new Power Builder windows the exact same color. Right? This was an example of me examining documentation, actually. The old the newer Oracle Forms and Reports system was a form of documentation because it was a document that existed so that I could understand the system. And I looked at it and I figured out where the fields were, where the buttons were, and all of that. And so that was me analyzing that system to make the new one look like the old one. Hopefully none of you ever have to deal with something quite as rigorous, quite as tedious as matching colors of screens from one system to another, but it can happen. All right. So what are some examples of documentation? All right. Well, everything, any type of document, memos, emails, customer complaints. All right. There may be an existing database system design. If there is an existing database structure, again, one of the companies that I worked for, our job was data conversion. Well, some of those systems that we were converting to ours were written in Microsoft Access. So, well, that was an existing database. They may have had a database design for that database. Yeah. User training manuals. So the documentation, you shouldn't just think of it as just paper or PDF documentation, right? It could be even emails that go back and forth. So for this class, for example, CSE 204, some of the examples of documentation that exist for this course, for this semester, are the thing I went over earlier, the group project assignment, an individual assignment I give, your assignment submissions that you give back to me, emails that you send me asking questions, even, it's not listed here because maybe this is a little bit before, but even the chats, right? Even the chats that exist on Microsoft Teams where you have messaged me asking me a question about the class. That's an example of a documentation for this class. All right. So documentation is anything like that. That's a lot of stuff, isn't it? So actually there is no, it goes straight into interviewing. I think maybe, I don't think they included a slide on this, but what is some of the pros and cons that you can think of? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of a documentation? Maybe talk back and forth in here. What are some of the advantages? What are some of the disadvantages you can think of for documentation? Like what would make it good to use? What would make it, maybe it'd be a problem to use? What do you guys think? What are some Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, remove some ambiguity because now we know certain, like, especially as far as terminology might be concerned. Yeah. It can be complicated, absolutely. Or especially because if you don't know certain terminology already, right, it may use words that you're unfamiliar with. It can also be a lot, right? It can also be a ton of documentation that you have to comb through to figure out what's important, what's not important. I mean, imagine if somebody wanted to understand, yeah, boring, yeah. But imagine if somebody wanted to learn about how the university system works. And they said, we'll look through, just pick any of you, or myself even, or maybe me. And they pick me and they say, we're going to go look through all his emails. And we're going to try to use that as a basis to figure out how the university system works. They'd spend a long time reading through a bunch of emails that have nothing to do with university, the way the university system works, right? I mean, how many of your emails are related to university work compared to how many emails may be related to other things, right? So documentation can be helpful, but it can be a lot of time to comb through all the different documentation to figure out what's important, what's not, what is related, what's not, and even what could be overlap. Mm, yeah. For- So the code is different from the way it's shown in like the examples? Do you mean documentation as the examples or? So can be. It can be, especially if there's any type of process, some type of lengthy bureaucratic process to be able to get update documentation. Or what if documentation changes frequently? So like, you know, here in Turkey, sometimes in America too, if a current system, the form that you need to use to apply for something or to make something happen, if it changes, what if you have the old form, you have the new form, which one's the good one, which one's, how do we tell the difference, that kind of thing. So it could be hard to do that too, hard to keep up with. Okay. All right, so we looked at one example of a type of fact-finding technique. So I realized the next one. Well, let's talk about the next one. Let's talk about interviewing, and then we will take a break. Okay. So interviewing is frequently used. Basically, what we do is we sit down with people. It could be our customers. It could be users themselves. It could be their users. If it's like, let's say we're making a banking system, and our customer is the bank. Well, guess what? We're making something for them, for their customers to use themselves. So we probably want to talk to them too, right? Okay. So what we'll do is we'll sit down with these different individuals and be able to have them tell us things about the system. We'll ask questions. We don't just say, hey, tell me about the system, and they just rattle off everything. We sit down with them, we ask them questions, we say, to find out more about how the system works. Okay. Okay. So some advantages of interviewing. Okay. Allows the interview to respond freely and openly, especially since if we can help them understand that we aren't necessarily their boss, right? We're not representing the company they work for, right? So, and what I mean by that is sometimes if we sit down with an employee of a company and we ask them things like, hey, so what do you not like about the system as it currently operates? They may have a hard time responding to that, or if they think that their boss will find out, or something like that. Okay. But especially if it's like the banking system I mentioned, if we talk to the customers of the bank, they may be more free about things that they don't like and things that they do like, right? Okay. Allows the interviewee to feel part of the project. See, buy-in is huge because remember, some of these people are going to be the users of whatever we create. And so if they feel like they were part of the designing, of the making of what it is that they're going to be using, that could be very helpful. Right? One thing by doing a face-to-face interview is an interviewer could follow up on interesting comments. So maybe someone makes a comment about part of the system we hadn't necessarily been focused on, but it comes to the realization like, oh, hey, that's something important. I should ask a follow-up question about that. Adapt or reword questions if they don't understand what we asked. I mean, think about taking a midterm exam or a final exam. And if you don't understand the question being asked on the exam paper, you can ask the proctor or you can ask me a question to say, hey, I don't understand this. Can you reword it? And we can do that. Okay. And especially allows another big advantage is allows the interviewer, the person asking the questions, to observe the other person's body language and what we call nonverbals. So what this is it's, and let me do this. Let me turn on my camera for this one because it may be helpful to see. Okay. And if I ask the first person, what do you think about the system as it exists? Or what do you think about the ATM that your bank offers? What do you think about the ATM user experience? And they're like, oh, it's great. I love it. Yeah. And then you ask another person, what do you think about the ATM system that your bank uses? And they say, it's great. I love it. Right? Same words, right? Both people used the same words to describe the system, didn't they? But we definitely understood that one of them meant one thing and the other one meant something entirely different, right? And so by being able to observe that, we can say, okay, what is it? What is it about the second guy that he really doesn't like the system, but he's saying he does? What's going on there, right? Okay. Now, generally, any solution to a problem, in this case, interviewing as being a solution to our fact-finding problem, right? We have some advantages. We will have some disadvantages too, some good and some bad. Okay. Disadvantages, it can be very time-consuming. Remember, we're taking people away from doing their jobs. We're taking people away from doing other things they might want to do. We have to separate them, especially if they may be working on a team, and we have to take them away from the team to be able to make things happen, right? To be able to have the interview with them. Right? Very dependent on the communication skills of the interviewer. If the interviewer takes both people that I just gave an example of, yeah, it's great, I love it, right? If they take both of those people and say, write down, yes, it's great, I love it. And they just say, okay, I'm done, right? I wrote down what they said, right? That would be a bad interviewer. right? We need someone who is able to pick up on some of those nonverbals and be able to go with those, right? And success can also be dependent on the willingness of people being interviewed, the interviewees, to participate, because they may say, no, I don't have time for this. I mean, I keep getting a phone call every once in a while from a phone number that I recognize as my own bank, actually. My banks, they're trying to offer me some campagna or something, some new thing. And it's gotten to the point I'm just ignore, right? Why? Because I don't really want to engage in that. I don't want to talk to them, right? So they are not going to be able to be successful in what they're trying to do because I'm not willing to be interviewed for this. I'm not willing to have them talk to me about this. So, all right. A couple more things about interviewing, then we'll take our break. There are two types, unstructured and structured, which is more unstructured is kind of more free and open. Structured more like we have a question and answer. Okay. But open-ended questions can allow the interviewee to respond in a way that seems appropriate. Open-ended questions would be not something that is just a specific answer, like a yes or no. So an open-ended question would be, describe for me something about the system that you wish worked better than it currently does. Okay, so now they can give an answer not only to what it is that they like or dislike, but they can also tell why. Kind of the describe aspect makes us do that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then close-ended questions can restrict answers. They're not bad, right? The multiple choice, true, false, yes or no questions are not bad. In fact, a lot of times they can be helpful to get the other person, the interviewee, to get them started talking, right? So, do you like the system? That's a yes or no answer, right? What is your favorite part of the system? Yeah, gives a specific answer. All right, but it can get that interviewee to start talking. Then we can use those open-ended questions to get more deep and informative answers. Okay, we shouldn't just use one or the other. We shouldn't just use only open-ended or only closed-ended questions when we're doing interviews to help ourselves understand the nature of the system that we're playing. Okay, or let's see. Yeah. Interviewing can be a mandatory thing. In my situation with the bank, I can just keep ignoring their phone call because I recognize their number now. But you're right. If you're an employee for a company and they've decided that they want to update some technology or some system they're using, and they tell you you have to go do this interview, you have to go be interviewed for this, yeah, it's kind of part of your job. Absolutely. Or even like this isn't an interview, but with the next one we'll talk about what we'll get to. Sorry, two more. Not after the observing. After observing, we'll talk about surveys. Doing surveys like question and answer surveys that aren't a face-to-face interview, but is a survey. You guys do a survey every year or every semester. You do a survey for this class, for all your other classes, right? And it's, as Ur mentions here, it's mandatory. You have to do it because otherwise you don't get to see your grades, right? So, all right, so that's interviewing and documentation. We'll move on into some other fact-finding techniques after the break, and I will see you guys in, let's see, what time is it now? 2:25, so we'll do 2:35. Okay, see you then.